Family was once everything in the Brown household. Laughter, chaos, crowded rooms, and endless voices. But something changed, and it did not happen overnight. It happened quietly through choices that slowly pushed people apart. And today, the man who once stood at the center of 18 children now sits alone at holidays, not because he was forgotten, but because he was left behind. And what really happened behind closed doors is far more unsettling than anyone realized. And once you hear the full story, you will never see the Brown family the same way again. Family was once a word that felt loud and alive, a word filled with movement, voices, footsteps, laughter echoing through long hallways and crowded kitchens, a word that meant togetherness even when chaos ruled the room. Because in the Brown household, family was never quiet. It was 18 children running past each other, wives moving in every direction, conversations overlapping, emotions clashing, yet somehow still connected. And for many years, that image was sold as proof that love multiplied could work, that devotion could stretch, that unity could survive anything. But slowly, almost invisibly, that meaning began to change, and what once felt alive began to feel staged, like a performance, repeating the same lines while the emotion behind them faded. And no moment exposed that transformation more clearly than the holidays, especially Thanksgiving, because Thanksgiving was supposed to be the one day where differences were set aside, where distance disappeared, where everyone returned to the table no matter what had happened during the year. But for the Browns, that table began to shrink, and at the center of that silence sat Cody Brown, a man who once claimed to be the heartbeat of a massive family, now increasingly absent from the very gatherings that defined it. And this absence did not begin suddenly. It did not arrive with one argument or one explosive moment. It arrived quietly through decisions framed as leadership, rules framed as protection, expectations framed as responsibility, and the world watched without fully realizing that the foundation was already cracking. And the year 2020 became the turning point, not because of what happened outside the family, but because of what was revealed inside it. When the pandemic swept across the world, fear, uncertainty, and isolation followed. And for the Browns, it became more than a health crisis. It became a loyalty test, one that would permanently redefine relationships. Because Cody did not respond as a father seeking connection, he responded as a ruler seeking compliance. Pages of rules emerged, strict instructions, demands that extended beyond safety and into submission. And suddenly, family was no longer about togetherness. It was about obedience. And those who complied were praised, while those who questioned were quietly pushed away. And when Thanksgiving approached that year, the tension reached its breaking point, because Christine chose to travel to Utah to be with her children, because Janelle chose to gather with her sons and her sister, because both women chose connection over compliance. And in doing so, they unknowingly crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, because in Cody's mind, their choices were not personal. They were betrayals. And when he sat in his confessional speaking of loyalty and disappointment, the message was chillingly clear. The holiday was no longer about gratitude, it was about control. And as the day arrived, only two women remained physically at his side, Mary and Rodden, seated at a table that once would have been surrounded by voices and movement, now filled with empty space. And that silence spoke louder than any argument, because it marked the moment the family split into those who obeyed and those who walked away. Not in anger, not in shouting, but in quiet, intentional distance. And Cody saw it, he felt it, and instead of asking why, instead of reflecting, he hardened. And the seeds planted that year did not fade when the pandemic ended. They grew deeper, stronger, shaping every relationship that followed. And as time moved forward, those choices echoed year after year, because once holidays become divided, they rarely reunite, and the emotional separation widened as Christine eventually chose to leave entirely, reclaiming her autonomy, her voice, her sense of self. And when she remarried in Utah, building a life filled with warmth, laughter, and visible peace, it became impossible to ignore the contrast between where she was and where Cody remained. Because while she moved forward, he remained stuck, anchored to the same grievances, the same expectations, the same narrative of betrayal. And Janelle followed her own path, choosing independence, choosing her children, choosing emotional stability over constant tension. And while she did not leave with dramatic declarations, her absence was just as powerful, because it signaled something deeper, that loyalty without respect is unsustainable. And Mary, who for years existed on the outskirts, found purpose in her own world, running her bed and breakfast, traveling, building a life untethered from a man who had long stopped prioritizing her. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Cody's world grew smaller, not because he was abandoned, but because he refused to meet anyone halfway. And the irony is that he often spoke about being excluded while simultaneously setting the conditions that guaranteed it, because every conversation came with demands, every reconciliation came with requirements, every apology was expected to flow toward him, never from him. And the world watched without fully realizing that the foundation was already cracking. And social media made this reality impossible to hide, because photos began to surface, smiling gatherings, full tables, children laughing, grandchildren playing, moments of warmth happening everywhere except where Cody was, and fans noticed immediately. Asking questions, pointing out patterns, and the truth slowly emerged that he was not being excluded, he was no longer being invited. And this distinction matters, because exclusion implies rejection, while lack of invitation reflects choice and boundaries. And year after year, Thanksgiving continued to pass with the same image repeated: tables filled elsewhere, empty chairs where he once sat. And while he remained physically with Robin and her children, the emotional gravity of the larger family had shifted away entirely. And even moments that should have drawn everyone together only deepened the divide. Because tragedy does not heal fractures built on control, it exposes them. And when loss struck in 2024, the pain rippled through the family in ways words cannot capture. And yet, instead of unity, there was distance. Instead of collective grief, there was separation. And the absence of a father figure during a moment that demanded presence shattered any remaining illusions, because grief does not ask for authority, it asks for humanity. And the response, or lack of it, spoke volumes, not just to the children, but to the audience watching as the narrative changed from complicated family dynamics to something far more heartbreaking, a story of emotional absence. And when voices within the family began to speak openly, calling out lies, disappointment, and emotional neglect, it was no longer speculation. It was confirmation that the disconnect had reached a point of no return. And still, Cody spoke of reconciliation, of therapy, of wanting healing, but his words carried conditions. And healing cannot grow in conditional soil, because love that must be earned through obedience ceases to be love at all. And the more he insisted on being the gatekeeper of forgiveness, the more isolated he became, because reconciliation requires humility, and humility cannot coexist with the need to remain in control. And as years passed, what remained was not a united family, but a diaspora spread across states and seasons: Utah, North Carolina, Michigan, Denver, each location holding its own version of Thanksgiving, its own laughter, its own traditions, formed intentionally, without hierarchy, without fear, without loyalty tests. And these gatherings were not acts of rebellion, they were acts of survival and joy. And the symbolic weight of those empty chairs became impossible to ignore, because absence repeated becomes statement, and every unfilled seat told the same story, that emotional safety matters more than obligation. And the final nail in the vision of unity came with the sale of Coyote Pass land, once described as the forever home, the place where the family would reunite, build, grow, and age together, reduced to a transaction, a closure, a quiet admission that the dream was over. Because land does not hold families together, people do. And by the time it was sold, the people had already moved on, and what remained was a much smaller circle, a version of family defined not by love multiplied, but by proximity preserved. And even then, the pattern continued, because Cody still framed himself as the one wronged, the one abandoned, the one misunderstood, failing to see that leadership without accountability fractures rather than unites. And as the seasons of Sister Wives continued, viewers watched a man slowly confront the consequences of decades of choices, moments of near realization quickly overshadowed by defensiveness and repetition, And the haunting truth settled in that this was not a story about holidays missed, but about relationships mishandled, about authority mistaken for care, about favoritism mistaken for loyalty. And as Thanksgiving continued to arrive each year, the contrast grew sharper. Because while one table remained quiet, others overflowed with warmth, laughter, gratitude, and genuine connection. And in that contrast, the real story revealed itself. That family does not disappear overnight. It erodes through unmet needs, unacknowledged pain, and a refusal to listen. And by the time the silence becomes noticeable, it has already been there for years, waiting. And this was only the beginning, because what followed would reveal just how deep the separation truly ran. As the years moved forward, the silence surrounding Cody Brown did not fade. It grew heavier, more noticeable, more permanent, because silence repeated becomes identity, and absence repeated becomes truth. And what once might have been explained away as scheduling conflicts or complicated logistics slowly revealed itself as a pattern too consistent to ignore. Because holidays came and went, birthdays passed, milestones arrived, grandchildren were born, and yet the presence that once dominated every room no longer appeared. And this disappearance was not sudden, it was cumulative, built from moments where listening was replaced by lecturing, where empathy was replaced by expectation, where conversations ended not with understanding, but with ultimatums. And the emotional cost of those choices began to show in the body language of the family, in the hesitation before answering questions, in the careful phrasing used when his name was mentioned. Because distance had become a form of self-preservation, and the children who once competed for attention had learned that peace often came from stepping away rather than leaning in. And this realization changed everything, because once someone learns that closeness brings pain while distance brings calm, the decision becomes instinctive, not emotional. And so, one by one, the emotional ties loosened, not through confrontation, but through quiet withdrawal. And this withdrawal confused Cody, because in his worldview, separation required rebellion, anger, or disrespect, and he could not understand a departure rooted in boundaries rather than defiance. And so he labeled it betrayal, because betrayal was easier to accept than responsibility. And that framing allowed him to remain the injured party rather than the source of injury. And this mindset followed him into every attempted reconciliation, because each conversation began with what others had done wrong rather than what he had failed to provide. And the children felt that imbalance immediately, because accountability cannot be negotiated, it must be offered freely, and without it, conversations become performances rather than healing. And so each attempt collapsed under the same weight, expectations placed on others, while self-reflection remained absent. And as time passed, the emotional distance solidified into something far more difficult to undo, a redefinition of family itself. Because for the adult children, family no longer meant obligation. It meant emotional safety, presence, consistency, and respect. And these were qualities they found elsewhere, with partners, friends, in-laws, siblings, and chosen communities. And once that shift occurred, there was no incentive to return to environments that demanded silence in exchange for belonging. And social media only amplified this transformation, because while Cody often spoke of loss, the images told a different story. Tables full of laughter, children relaxed, smiles, genuine warmth, moments that could not be staged because authenticity shows in the small details. And audiences saw it immediately, recognizing joy unburdened by tension. And each photo served as a quiet declaration that family can exist without hierarchy, without fear, without constant evaluation. And the more those moments appeared, the more isolated Cody seemed, not because others spoke against him, but because life moved forward without him. And that forward motion is what made the divide irreversible, because relationships can sometimes be repaired after